You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Aimee Whitcroft. Aimee is a content design, service design, and training consultant to New Zealand's local and national governments. She is one of New Zealand's top plain English experts and advocates for open source, open data, and open government. Aimee's work also spans diverse and vital topics such as civic technology, service design, placemaking, social good, and sustainability and strategy. Aimee has also contributed to futurecasting work at the New Zealand Ministry of Transport. Aimee, welcome to the show.
Kia ora, Tim. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
My pleasure. So I'll start with a bang. I know that you're a big fan of open source and open access and the like. And I was researching the topic, not just for your show, but for another person who I interviewed who was interested in Linux in particular as an open source platform. And I got curious to know if intelligence agencies use open source technologies like Linux in their work, because the theory is that even though it's open source, it's more secure, but that's debatable, right? And maybe, so I was just curious. But in that Google search, I stumbled across an article called Open Source to Dominate Intelligence by Signal Magazine. And I'll just read a brief passage from it. This is the tsunami of information that will hit with the full exploitation of 5G cellular will create a wealth of open source intelligence that will define the art in coming years. Now, I shared that article with you. What's your reaction to that?
It's such an interesting article. So I work in open data a lot at the moment, and areas around data sovereignty and data rights and justice and equity, and of course open source. That was interesting in a couple of ways. The first of them is that they didn't really define in the article what they meant by open source intelligence. And I know from conversations with sort of colleagues and friends that intelligence has a really, really wide set of descriptions and definitions. But yeah, it was an interesting article in that they were, I think, predominantly talking about two things here. So open source technology stacks. So of course, Linux is the really, really famous one that an awful lot of proprietary corporate software, for example, is built on, but it's still built on an open source code stack. And then the other one was talking about data. So open data, or what some people call open source data, but that's a bit of a misnomer. And basically saying, yeah, there's going to be so much more data. The open source tech is getting better and better. The tools are getting better and better. But also there's more and more data. So it makes sense that we are all sort of using stuff that's in the same pool so that we can see what other people might be using and be working, I guess, to not normalize against it, but it gives us an idea of what other people are doing. I think they have a really good point. What's interesting, though, is that we're seeing all across the internet, certainly in the Western world, a preponderance for not open source data. You know, if we think about some of the big tech giants, what they're doing is hoovering up vast amounts of data and locking it up. So it'll be really interesting to see. There's a bit of a fight being joined between the open people and the keep it all to ourselves people. And I'm not getting into privacy here. I do believe very strongly in protecting privacy. But yeah, it was really interesting to see the intelligence folk really starting to think about it. And it is a big thing, is there is so much data out there, is rather than maybe making new data, same with code stacks, why don't we use what's already there and leverage it better? So that's I mean, I could talk about just that subject for hours and hours and hours, but certainly interesting.
Well, my reaction to this was more appalled, actually. I think you're being kind and fair and balanced. I read it and I thought, wow, if every person with a tinfoil hat read this about the connection of 5G to intelligence gathering and this notion of everything they can glean from 5G data being somehow open source, I thought was a bit much. Basically what they're saying, if it's easy to steal or easy to invade your privacy, it's open source. And I'm not accustomed to that kind of mustache twirling happening on the open internet. I was surprised by that. It's almost like saying Verizon is a branch of the military.
That makes sense. It's not how I interpreted it. With your interpretation, yes, I would probably be flipping tables and throwing things as well. Certainly 5G is all about, being able to handle a lot more data a lot faster. So we just end up with more and more and more, potentially more and more and more data being swapped. But that's also another really big and really interesting subject around not only sort of issues like data rights and sovereignty and justice and privacy and so forth, but also the ecological impact of our data obsession. All of this servers consume huge amounts of energy potentially. Some of that energy is quite dirty energy because it's often where energy is maybe a bit cheaper. So it's coal fed. So, there's a lot of stuff going in there. But yes, you're right, moustache twirling, but moustache twirling is already happening, right? And always happens. It's not like agencies haven't previously said, for example, let's scoop up a whole bunch of metadata. Possibly this just means it's a bit more transparent. I don't know. The article made me want to go and sort of fish around in that website and start reading stuff about intelligence.
I know. I was wondering if I was labeling myself as a security risk, even reading it. So I stopped.
I think being on the internet and being alive, for some governments at least, has you as a security risk. But yeah. I wouldn't worry about it too much, right?
I hope I don't.
Not now.
No. So while we're talking about open data, you have an article, Open Data and APIs Fueling Innovation. And one of the things you say is that open data and open APIs fuel awesomeness. So what kind of awesomeness are you talking about? What's possible with these technologies?
So the background to that piece was I was giving a chat at a conference a few years ago, and it was a conference about APIs. So that's why I brought in the remit from just open data, which I think a lot of people still think of as, like a file that you can download. As opposed to an endpoint where you can sort of plug things directly into each other. And it was aimed at the private sector. A bunch of government folk and open government folk already, to some extent, understand the value of open data and want to contribute to it. But the private sector is a little different on this, and we'll talk about that more later in this segment. But there's a number of things. So open data and APIs, what they can do, there's a whole bunch of social value that they can deliver. You can imagine that giving data into the commons enables people. Well, it builds transparency around, for example, what governments are doing. That in turn can help to build trust because people are demonstrating that they're trustworthy by opening up and showing what they're up to. People can start to build capability around how to interact with that data. It can improve decision-making at, the hyper-local level up through to the national level because people can see what's going on. Of course, people can build really cool services off it as well. And another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that it can help organizations interrogate their own data better because often the act of opening up data makes that data available. So it's not stuck on, a desktop somewhere or, in somebody's head or in a folder somewhere or a PDF document lost on a website. And often it's been a bit cleaned and people have thought about standards and how you communicate it and document it and all of those things. But there's also other commercial value. So I already mentioned the ability to build businesses, for example, off data like this, and people do all over the world. Excuse me, I have something stuck in my throat today. To build services, but more than that, it enables people, who and commercial businesses maybe aren't always quite as interested in social good, for example, as the public sector is, because they have different levers, right? They have different priorities. But you could do things, or opening up stuff enables businesses to have influence over the state of the art, the state of play. So open source is a perfect example of this. If you're making stuff really open and other people can build on it, you're influencing the stack and the languages that people are using in their coding. Of course, you're contributing back into the commons, which is great, because if everyone just takes from the commons and no one gives back, you have the tragedy of the commons. Yes. It's kind of a thing. You can influence standards, of course. I mean, the VHS Betamax situation, for those of us who are old enough to remember it, was a classic example of that. It also enables you to see, to start to build collaborations or co-opetitions or competitions with other organizations who are in your space to see what other people might be doing, if they're hopefully giving in as well. And there's a great story to be told. Consumers are increasingly looking to companies and the private sector to behave a little bit better, to be better citizens, really, of their communities and their societies. This enables one to build a story about how one is actually doing that and be able to show the real value. And you get to know your users a lot better as well, but not in creepy ways that means sucking up data about them without necessarily their full permission permission, but TNCs are not permission. It enables you to get to know them really well. What is the kind of stuff that they want? What do they like? What do they not like? And really builds that trust with them as well. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, it opens up collaboration across sectors in really interesting ways, which can enable things like smart cities, for example.
Right. And I do want to get into that with you. That's a fascinating area. One comment you made in the article, and I will share this in the show notes, is that publicly available doesn't mean for a short period of time only. It doesn't mean for a select group of people or with barriers to entry, like being charged to access it. And we discussed before the show our mutual interest in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And that passage reminded me of the Vogons, who, when they were about to blow up the planet Earth to make way for a hyperspace bypass, said, well, you've had 50 years to read this in the local planning council in Alpha Centauri. Yeah. And so, just because it's available or ostensibly available doesn't mean it's convenient or easily understood. And so I take your point that the APIs are for that. What type of data? I mean, I guess there's multiple kinds. One is what is the local government doing that will affect you, but also what's happening with people. What are some of the examples of the uses of these APIs?
APIs and open data in general. So as you've said, it can be, what are agencies spending money on? Or what are they planning to spend money on? Planning, indeed, is a subject of major interest. I'm not sure what it's like over there, but New Zealand has a very strong sense of place, of our land and our air and our sea and our skies. And people are intrinsically interested in that sort of spatial goodness. So really good spatial data, GIS data. You can imagine people can build maps of all kinds of things. What's coming down the line, for example, what roadworks are being planned, or what is your council thinking in terms of upcoming legislation or policy around how bits of land are developed or not developed, or protected or not protected. You can start to build things like, recently I've started to see people build really beautiful things around emissions, calculated for everything from cars to building activities. You can start to see economic activity, for example, and you can use open data as proxies for economic activity. You can see the passage of people and different modes of transport across areas. I mean, basically anything you can think of, you can probably start to get a really good understanding of with open data. The big thing here, of course, and I mentioned it before, is standards. If the data isn't, it doesn't have to be of the highest quality, and that sometimes holds people back because they want it to be perfect. And it's like, look, it doesn't need to be perfect. Just tell people that it's not perfect.
Right.
So really document what you've done well. And one needs to do it with APIs just as much as with flat files, if not more, because far fewer people know how to deal with APIs, right, than an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV. So it's great to release in all of these ways. But if we can start to make the data of decent quality and interoperable, which is where the standards come in, you can imagine you could start to lay weather data over transport data over economic activity data, for example, or health data over economic activity data. That's something that people are really interested in at the moment globally, for example. So you can really start to build not just simple little services, but quite detailed, quite specific services. And I think that's great as well, to have stuff at the hyperlocal level, as well as at the sort of big generic national or supranational level that really helps people live their lives better. Because at the end of the day, I think one can look at the stuff in two ways. It's either a way for a small number of people to make more money for themselves, or it's a way to really try and help empower everybody in not only their dealings with government, but their dealings with each other. And more than that, it's not just about humans. I think it's about being life-centered, not human-centered. So how can we build things that enable us to I don't want to say empower the grass in our country, but something like that, to make sure that we are good custodians and stewards of all of the life around us, not just each other as humans.
So I'm thinking of a couple of examples, and you tell me if they're reasonable with the data sets you've seen. But for example, if I'm planning to build a shopping mall, I'd want to know the incomes around the area and the amount of traffic in the area. That's a huge investment.
Yep.
Or if I wanted to make an argument that there ought to be a play structure near my apartment building, I can make the argument, well, there's this many children of the right age. Or
Absolutely. I've seen people do some really interesting modeling, for example, taking income data, laying it, on a map, because for those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to pass maps visually, maps are tremendously powerful for people. We understand them quite intuitively. But yeah, so taking sort of a map of your council areas and your suburbs and things like that, taking income data, taking transportation access data, layering them over each other. And then that enables planners to start seeing, for example, okay, which areas are really well served with public transport, which maybe aren't as well served by public transport, so people are using more cars, but what's the access to jobs and things in that area? How does that change maybe how we plan our spending on infrastructure of various sorts? So that's tremendously powerful. And often people are most interested in those things of, what's happening in my area? Can I get to work? And what's my government up to? Of course, in different nations and different cultures, you get quite different priorities. So with some people, they really want to know what their government's up to because there's that lower levels of trust. Here in New Zealand, we're fortunate enough to have quite high levels of trust in our government. So I think that people probably spend less time hunting through exact expenditure, but we're very, very interested in what's being planned. Housing is a massive issue here. So, people are really interested in that. Transportation, I guess, is a massive issue everywhere. So people really want to know what movements are happening, what's the car mix, all of that kind of stuff. And this is the thing with open data, right, is until one's got really strong sort of user groups and really strong ties in with the communities that are consuming that data, to some extent, you don't really know what people want or what they're doing with it. But that's something that open data practitioners around the world are really looking to get a lot better at, is saying, how can we do more with the engagement piece here? Very
good. So I'll move to another article that we exchanged, and that is the third wave of open data. And again, it talks a bit about the issues you just raised, the importance of open data, but there's also an interesting set of characteristics that are talked about in there. And one is this idea of the three waves of open data. Can you talk about what these transitions mean?
Absolutely. So the first wave of open data was characterized mostly by a sort of a pull sensibility from the public. So that was about requesting through, I think it's called FOIA, up where y'all are, Freedom of Information Act. Here it's called the OIA.
In Canada, I think it's called FIPA, but it's the same idea.
Right, yeah. Thank you. And here it's called the OIA, so the Official Information Act. Requests to government agencies to say, can you please give us this information? So you can imagine the people who were asking for that were predominantly specialists in these areas, journalists, technologists, people of lawyers, activists, people of that sort. So a higher barrier to entry there. I'm just also looking at my notes on the side just to make sure I don't get anything horribly wrong, because it would be very, very embarrassing as an open data practitioner. And then there was the second wave. So open data is a relatively new movement as well. It's only a couple of decades old, right? So we're not talking about stuff that's been going on for 50 years or anything. The second wave of data really came along with Web 2.0. I feel so old saying Web 2.0. And open source as well. And that was more of so whereas the previous one was pull from activists and the public, this is more a push, right, from government saying, okay, we understand that the stuff is really important. It's really good. So what we're going to start doing is just pushing stuff out. Anything that we can, we'll just sort of automatically is probably the wrong word, but start to put out. Some stuff is put out automatically in an automated sense. Some of it is humans behind the scenes, like cranking the wheels, right?
But
and cleaning
routinely.
Up. Yeah, exactly. And that's really cool. And so they're open by default, I think, was, if that makes sense to people, open by default was the major thought there, is that unless there's a really good reason not to open it, privacy, commercial sensitivity, that sort of thing, it should be open. And you can imagine that the major audiences there were all of the previous people, but some of them might still be putting in OIA requests because they want something very specific. But you had civic technologists, for example, starting to join in. You started to have the private sector joining in as consumers of that data because now it was there. So the third wave, which is kind of just starting, I mean, this is quite new thinking. People have been thinking it for the last year or two, or somewhere around there, but are starting to write beautiful papers about it, is characterized quite differently again. So this is collaboration. This isn't just push. This isn't just pull. It's saying here, publish with purpose, I would say, is probably the main thing. So yes, if you can open it, you should open it, but there are limited resources, right? Opening data costs money, which is fair, but we don't have unlimited people and time and resources and server space and. So what can we focus on? What's going to drive the most value for the people who want to consume that data, but also making sure that we're protecting the rights of people as we even collect that data and store that data, let alone serve the data out. So are we making sure that we're working with communities to understand their concerns, the risks around opening this data, what people might do with it, what can we do to guard against misuse, whether unintended or intended, and make sure that whatever we release is also of most value to people. If we have to choose, let's prioritize, and we do have to choose. So that's really interesting. And those first two waves are very powerful, and they're still happening, right? It's kind of like the future's here, it's just unevenly distributed. Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Gibson. But the idea is they're all cumulative, that one builds on the other. This is basically a journey of maturity here. As our maturity grows, so do our conversations. And so does how we put this all together. So this is really about partnerships, and this is where the conversation, kind of like my talk to the private sector about APIs, like years and years and years ago about open data, and saying, join the party. This is really that, again, is saying to the private sector, join the party. Let's work in really strong collaboration, because y'all have a whole bunch of amazing data. Let's see what we can do together with the data you hold, the data we hold, and really work in our communities. So there's also beautiful concepts like embedding data scientists in communities, for example, rather than saying, we'll have a group of people here who are very clever and very knowledgeable, but fundamentally divorced from your reality. So they understand your reality, they're part of your reality. And then you start getting into like intermediaries and data collaboratives, and it's an absolutely fascinating time to be a part of this. It's more challenging. Things like indigenous data sovereignty, for example, when I was talking about people's concerns about the collection, storage, use of the data, that's a relatively new subject that's fascinating and complex, and there are no easy answers here. But really, really important, because if we can get this right, we can do beautiful stuff with the data rather than it just being something that gets used against people a lot, right, which seems often to be the case these days with a lot of data. But it's tough. But for people who are interested in philosophy as much as technical stuff, I would say that these are some of the areas to be involved with.
For sure. This is an interesting discovery for me, is that what the deciding who can see what data, and you do get into areas of philosophy or ethics that are completely unfamiliar to somebody whose job has been to set you up with a drive that you can share with your colleagues, for example. Now you have a whole profession of deciding whether that maybe you've tipped things with so much data that it becomes personally identifying, or that, for example, the insurance companies are using it, or the mortgage companies are using it in ways that are contrary to public policy. So there's all kinds of stuff in there. It really is a complicated world, but as you say, it's so powerful, it's so useful.
Absolutely. And this is where people talk about shared data as well. So for a while, at least based from what I saw, it was sort of open data was here, and then shared data. So that's data that people share amongst themselves, but isn't open to the public, right? And then you have closed data, that's data that does not leave the situation. And there are some very good reasons often around security, funnily enough, for that sort of thing as well.
Yeah.
It's those aren't separate silos, right? This is all just a beautiful landscape here. And this is one of many axes around data. But saying, there will be situations where this data shouldn't be open, it should be shared, but then should it be open-ish? If we share it, who would we share it with? How do we know what they're doing with it? Are they going to do the right things? I mean, there you can sign contracts. I guess it gets a bit simpler in some ways, but yeah, as you say, once you start layering data, it can get really useful, but it can also get incredibly tricky. And the thing with ethics is that every ethical systems differ. There isn't one view of what ethical looks like. So you need to start having really, really complex conversations just in one's community about what ethics look like, let alone across different countries and cultures. You know, people might shout and go, that's unethical, but for that culture, that's entirely fine.
Yeah.
And vice versa. It's really, really, really interesting.
Well, and yeah, there are some cultures that are more collectivist and some that are more individualist, and yeah, there's definitely ways to turn the dials there. But you mentioned, you know, how it differs around the world and how it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. How much, in your experience, is the adoption of this open data concept happening at national governments versus local governments? How do you compare their achievements?
I would say that from what I've seen, again, so all of this comes with codicils and coders and asterisks, so based on my experience.
Yes.
Open data is probably more of a thing at sort of the national and supranational levels. So to some extent between governments potentially, or you know, some of the governments really involved in open data, the people tend to know each other and they tend to sort of like talk a lot amongst themselves. The global south is really starting to rise up into the open data scene, which is fantastic. As a global south gal myself, I'm African originally. But yeah, at the local level, it's a bit different. So this also, there are vast differences across open data sort of uptake and maturity across different local jurisdictions, often to do with things like money and size. So you can imagine with really small councils, I live in one here in New Zealand, and there's 5,000 people living in the entire district. And it's really spread because it's a pretty rural area. So you can imagine there isn't heaps of money sloshing around to have a gigantic council with a staff dedicated to the opening of data. A lot of the smaller councils might have like one IT guy who spends, you know, his time making sure that the emails work and the printer is, which is on the fritz again, is working again, and doesn't necessarily have a lot of time to be thinking about, you know, having a data catalog. What data do we have? You can't open data if you don't know what data you have, right? And understand it. What data do we have? What can we open? What do people want? How do we improve its quality? How do we do the user engagement? This stuff is all time intensive. And often people also don't quite know where to start. You know, they've read about it. They're like, fantastic, I want to do this. I know people in my community really want access to more information, really want to be more involved in their local thing, but where do we start? So there's a lot of work going on, you know, here in New Zealand and internationally to say, let's start looking more at helping those at the local level, because that's where you can get huge use out of the data. That's the hyper-local again, people really wanting to understand where they live and how it works and have strong input into that, but also helping the people who are going to be doing it. So can we come up with frameworks? So and myself and other people have previously released frameworks that we've built for open data as open source information, open data itself, so that other people could take it up and reuse it rather than having to try and come up with something themselves. Can we build things like boilerplate data contracts, or boilerplate clauses at least, that could go into contracts with vendors that talk to the data ownership situation, so somebody doesn't necessarily have to try and do it themselves? Could we do things like build modular open source open data policies, again, so that people could pick it up, take it and use it? And also the infrastructure. Are there ways that we could really start to leverage the ability to build open source and modular software so that people can use it really easily? I'm not saying it needs to be an off-the-shelf solution, but what can we do to make the barriers to entry really, really low for people who want to start on that journey, and then help them along as their maturity grows? But it's a bit of a toughie. Nobody has any firm answers to this, but there are a lot of people who care deeply and are having lots and lots of thoughts. And of course, it'll differ for each council, for each jurisdiction, as to what works best for them. So we don't want to trap people into saying thou shalt do the following things. Certainly in New Zealand, that wouldn't work anyway. New Zealanders are not known for being good at being told what to do.
I think that's some of that is human nature. I actually am very interested in that, because I was in my head imagining that the easiest thing would be for the larger governments, the provincial, the state, the national, to say, okay, well, these are the standards, and impose it. But what you're describing is a lot lighter touch, right? It's maybe we'll provide you the storage space and you can know that it's secure, or maybe we'll provide you with, I love that term, boilerplate, because it means that you are free to use it. It's not required. But if you do, it conforms with the standards of the data that we have, and therefore you can compare with other councils. And
yeah, exactly. And this is where standards are tremendously helpful. I'm a big fan of standards. Mandating standards can be difficult because not everybody is necessarily able to do that. But I also hear a lot of conversations where people go, please just give us some standards that we could adhere to in terms of data standards, but other standards, so that we kind of would know what we're doing, so we don't have to redo this again in 2 years.
Yeah.
But I think
telling me, you're helping me.
Exactly. And I think that's what all of this is about, right? It's not that more sort of top-down command and control, dare I say, patriarchal mode of doing things, which is, parental, thou shalt do the following things. It is saying, we're here to enable you and to empower you and to be in conversation and collaboration with you. How can we do things that will most help you to do your own thing? We want to, well, my personal thing is seeing people rise in their own capability, in their own capacity, in their own maturity, and their own ability to self-direct. It's all about agency, right? People having agency to make choices for themselves that are best for themselves and their communities, rather than someone coming in and going, we know what's best for you, because invariably they don't.
Well, it's interesting because it's agency, but constructed in such a way that it actually takes advantage of and helps construct a commons. So you're really sort of straddling the collective and the individual by taking this approach. So it's great. But of course, details matter, and I know you don't have all the details, but I do wonder how open data could improve responses to things like COVID-19, and how we balance, or how you would propose to balance, the need to know what's going on with our neighbors versus privacy and that kind of thing.
That's been such an interesting one, and seeing how different countries have handled it has been absolutely
Talk about cultural differences, right?
So interesting. And I'm not going to get into a rant about the countries that I think have done very poorly. I think New Zealand's done pretty well in terms of balancing individual privacy with sort of collective good. But the conversation with COVID was really interesting in that it really jump-started a conversation about better data sharing capability. This is both at the technological, but also at the policy and even regulation levels, right? Because suddenly, because this happened quite fast. I mean, people have seen it coming for years, but again, that's another rant that we don't have to get into. Suddenly it was happening quite fast, and a whole bunch of governments realized that even internally, they didn't have a good setup to be able to share data quickly with each other. Or possibly at all. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of flurry behind the scenes as people tried to sort that out. And again, that's a mixture of technological, like, can we actually plug things together, or are we using similar standards so it's interoperable, through to, are we allowed to? Do we have agreements in place to do this? We don't have agreements in place to do this. What are we going to do? Mm-hmm. So that's been really, really, really interesting. The open data aspect, of course, is interesting too, is how has COVID-19 impacted a whole bunch of things: transport, health, public attitudes towards safety, all of these kinds of things. So it's part of a whole bunch of research, which people are starting to open up as well. But I think the major thing there was around data sharing. And there are, if your listeners are keen, there's something called the Policy Plus Initiative, plus as the sign, which has been really interesting. And that's a whole bunch of international organizations, including the International Open Data Charter, coming together to say, what are the lessons that we can learn from COVID in terms of how we handle data? And how can we really learn those lessons? So the next time this happens, because this will happen again, how can we not be on the back foot as much last time? And we want to spend less time scurrying and freaking out in the background because we can't get done what we need to get done, and more time being really on the front foot and being a lot more proactive rather than reactive. But it was quite fascinating to watch everything that happened, and how the conversations just suddenly stepped up in their maturity, I think, is a lot of very senior people suddenly understood that this data thing is not just for the IT nerds sitting in the dark office in the corner, right?
Right.
This is about everybody. And it suddenly went, okay, now we're starting to get it. It was kind of like remote work. You know, previously it was this thing that a few strange nerds did. And now it's becoming kind of like
just about everybody, yeah.
Well, you just go overnight, you know, people said it's going to take 10 years to sort out remote working. And pretty much overnight, remote working was a thing. So I think it's that. And it's a terrible line, but this line of never waste a good crisis.
Mm-hmm.
One can sometimes leverage really powerful things out of terrible things. And I don't think that's a bad thing either. I used a lot of things there. But if we can learn lessons from terrible circumstances, I think that's really powerful, so we can help be better with them next time.
Well, it's definitely encouraging to know that some good can come from it all. So I agree. You sort of touched on this already, but not explicitly, and that is the human-centered approach to open data. And this the ideas that come from IDEO around human-centeredness and design thinking. Do you see any applications of design thinking to how people are looking at using open data and constructing open data sets?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. It's again very unevenly distributed, and that is a mixture of, as I've mentioned previously, sort of time and resources and things. Design-centered anything can take quite a bit longer. There's also a tendency for people to lapse into what we call innovation theater. So, doing the motions, like we've put post-its everywhere, which means we're doing design thinking. And it's like,
yes.
Okay, that's not actually what design thinking is. Do you even know what the double diamond is, for example? But it's also sometimes just a lack of knowledge, right? And skills. So the knowledge is understanding that this thing exists, that it's all about talking with the people who are going to be using your stuff, going back to them again and again and again, having a conversation with your people as opposed to designing at them. You know, you're really designing with them. But also understanding that this is a hardcore skill. The people who really know what they're doing, this isn't something that you can read some articles and suddenly be working in design thinking. So really respecting the skills of various people and having this be really multidisciplinary. Disciplinarian is different, but multidisciplinary. So you want to have everybody involved. You want your design thinkers. You want your communities involved. You want your end users involved, right? And so I'm seeing more and more conversation about, get out amongst your users, figure out what it is they need and want. Then you start to figure out what data do we have that could help with that? How should we release it? You know, what formats, what standards, blah, 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 blah. Maybe work with them in analyzing or using that data or learning how to analyze and use that data. But all of this is quite tricky. And the big thing with open data is you don't know who your users are, because the idea is that because you don't ask people to sign in and register and tell you all about themselves when they use your data, you don't know who they are. And this is where we get into conversations about doing things like building user groups. So saying, hey, look, if you'd like to join a user group about this data or this sector or something, please join in. Let's start a community. Let's start a conversation. Let's really figure out what we're doing with this data.
And
the other thing
it comes back to that purpose-built open data set in the APIs. Like if you can rally around a purpose, then you're much more likely to identify your user group.
Of doing it, and that's more the sort of, we've put it out there, now we need to identify who's using it. The other thing really is to go out into your communities to say, what do you want? What can we find? What can we open? Because then you have a pretty good idea at least who your initial users are. So people are really starting to, I think, take it very seriously. It's just figuring out how, which is always the trick. But indeed, the design thinking, I know some people who've been doing it for the last couple of years. There's a chap called Richard Pietro, who's also Canadian, who a few years ago was going and working with people. He called it reverse open data. It wasn't the second open data wave of push it out and see what happens. This is design the open data from the very, very start with the community and the users, and then publish it, which is very much more third wave, right? So it's exciting, but there's also, sorry, one more thing here. I think one of the risks that I see with design thinking and with is that people tend to then conflate it with human-centered, which is a very fun line that a bunch of people have started using recently, human-centered, because it sounds so much nicer than bureaucracy-centered or CEO-centered or, private sector-centered or whatever the case may be. The thing with human-centered is there's an anthropocentrism there that makes me tremendously uncomfortable, because anthropocentrism hasn't done our planet a terribly large amount of good so far. So this is where I like saying words like life-centered. So yes, it's difficult to go out and talk with your local trees and your local wildlife about what data might suit them. But if you're working strongly with your community, there will be people in that community who will be there to act as stewards on behalf of the land and the life and the seas. So make sure that you're really engaging with them as well. It's not about rolling one's eyes and going, oh, the greenies are at it again. It's really worth listening to their concerns and their thoughts. And in that way, we can build life-centered data, not just human-centered stuff.
The other aspect of design thinking that excites me is it's a pushback against this idea that we're only going to do it once, pour it in concrete, it's done. Because I find that especially public institutions, because they view themselves as stewards of not just the information and the resources, but also the money, that they say, okay, we're gonna have to get this right. And so they devote a lot of time to planning around things they don't really know the outcome of, and investing so much upfront that they can't afford to adjust it when they get the feedback they want.
Yep.
How do you recommend avoiding that circumstance?
That is such a tricky one. You can hear the scream of a million voices just raised up from horror. It's a difficult one. I think you've hit the nail on the head, especially with larger agencies. There is very strong pressure with how budgets work and things. You've got to know your 3-year plan, your 5-year plan, your 10-year plan. If you're involved in stuff like infrastructure, you might need to know your 30-year plan, because, I don't know, infrastructure takes a very long time to build and is very expensive. But that is sort of fundamentally at odds with, as you said, the iterate and optimize situation, which is something I shout a lot at work. Not shout, but say a lot at work, is iterate and optimize. It's tricky. I think the thing here is to know that there are some things where you're always going to want a waterfall situation. If you're building, for example, a bridge, you probably don't want to be iterating and optimizing while you're building the bridge. There's a highway in Wellington where clearly that kind of happened, and then the bridge suddenly stops. It's an overpass. It's quite ouch. But there are plenty of things where that probably isn't appropriate. Software development life cycles, for example, are a thing. But of course, vendors like to tie people into 5-year contracts or 10-year contracts. I think it's just trying to get people more comfortable, I think, with the approach of, let's start this, see how we go. If nothing else, if it isn't working, we have early signals to stop or to get out or to change, rather than, as you say, getting trapped into some sort of, well, we're committed now, let's just throw bad money off to good. But
we promised to build it, and you promised to like it, so leave us alone.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's predominantly comfort as much as anything else. It's really scary doing it the first few times, especially if one's used to the other approach. But once people see this is in fact lower risk, it's viewed as higher risk, but humans are terrible at judging risk. Once people see that in many ways this is a lower risk way to approach things, you can get there. And this is where it's a good idea to start small, start small, wait for it, iterate and optimize. Start with something that isn't incredibly high profile and heads will roll if it doesn't go well. Start with some other stuff, get people comfortable with how it works, start to spread that knowledge through the organization and the comfort through the organization. And then over time, you can start adding bigger and bigger stuff to it. And of course, learn from other organizations. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, to start from scratch and make all the same mistakes. Look at what's happened in other jurisdictions. Reach out to people across the world to say, we see you did this. How did it go? Mm-hmm. What did you learn from it? That doesn't mean the same things will or won't work, for us, for example, here in New Zealand or in our jurisdictions. But it's worthwhile learning the lessons that have already been learned so we can try and avoid some of the major pitfalls. Or say, oh, that's interesting. We can see why it wouldn't work there, but that would work brilliantly there. Let's give it a bash. I think it's that experimentation mindset that we need to try and get back into people, because we've kind of beaten it out of them. Sorry, that's a terrible expression. We've strongly encouraged out of them for a very long time.
maybe that does happen in New Zealand. We don't do a lot of beating in Canada, but it's a
No.
more rugged country, New Zealand. So.
No, we don't. That's a terrible expression. I'm so sorry, listeners.
Oh, don't worry. I knew you were using it euphemistically.
We're a pretty pacifist country. We're not known for getting into huge barneys.
I'd like to move to another article now that we exchanged, which was about Tim Berners-Lee and how he's sort of reacting to the other problem that comes with data, not the fact that it's not available, but rather that sometimes things that we don't wish people to know about us are out on the internet somehow, or are being used maybe in ways that are manipulative to us and ways we can't fully understand because they're trapped in private databases. Do you want to talk a little bit about what he's trying to do?
So this is really lovely. I'm sure everyone knows who Sir Tim is, so I'm not going to go into that. But he's got a concept called pods, the idea of personal data pods. And the idea here is that each individual, so I'll use myself as an example, is that data about me is entirely basically owned and managed by me. I've got a pod, which is probably a little sliver on a server somewhere, as the article put it, that holds all of my data about me. So that could be anything from my web browsing habits through to my shoe size, through to really, personal medical data, for example, or economic, financial data. Everything from the trivial and public through to the incredibly personal and powerful. But that's managed by me, so that if somebody wants to access it, rather than a large tech company going, well, we've got 200 data points on you because every time a friend of yours logs into our service, even if you don't, we know more about you. I can say, okay, this healthcare provider, for example, can access this data in my pod for this purpose, but not these other purposes. Basically, you allow access on a potentially a case-by-case basis, which I think is tremendously powerful. It's certainly very exciting and fits in really well with this idea of data trusts that a lot of people have been talking about, although data trusts tend to be more on a group level than a sort of individual stewarding all of their own data all of the time level. So each new service that wanted to connect to you, you would give it permissions to access certain kinds of data. I think it's a lovely idea. I know he's been talking about it for the last few years, and I noticed that he is rolling out real life trials with people. So that's really, really powerful, and I see it as a great complement to the data trusts and data collaboratives idea, because that's more at the personal level. I do have a concern about it, and the concern here is that, well, once again, we're taking the onus of organizations to behave well in their approach, to be ethical. And sometimes we might actually need to regulate what ethical looks like per culture, right? Certainly, you see it with the GDPR and so forth, where that's starting to happen. So we're taking all of the onus off people to behave well. The other thing is that this presumes that everybody has access to the knowledge and the skills and the infrastructure they need and the time to manage their own personal data in that way. Now, I'm not saying that this means it's not a goer. It's the same issue with data trusts. It's always an issue with anything to do with digital identity. But it is something that I hope people are really, really thinking about, is what happens for the people who aren't able to manage their personal data in that way. Do we then end up with a situation, it's even worse than now, where the haves who have the skills and the capacity and the capability are ever further and further away from the have-nots, and the have-nots are further exploited as a result? What are we going to do about that? So I'm sure he's thinking about it. I know ethicists around the world are thinking about this, because AI is a huge conversation at the moment, and that's all about data, and that's all about access to data. Personally, I've been thinking about how could we build licensing regimes, kind of like Creative Commons, which gets used for open data, but add on some other ones, like you can use this data, but not if you're feeding it into a facial recognition algorithm, for example. Yeah. You can use data, but not if you're feeding it into algorithms of any sort, blah, 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 blah. To really start, and I think we're going to have to start getting a lot more focused in our licensing around data and its uses, but making sure that we're bringing people with us, not leaving them behind. Now,
so you were right to point out that I should have revealed who Tim Berners-Lee is. And my understanding is he was a pioneer in the World Wide Web. And so his reaction is to the Frankenstein he created. I think he wants to find a way to civilize Frankenstein's monster a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, he's whereas other people have, made billions and billions of dollars off it. Look, so Tim's done just fine. He's gotten a Turing Award. He's widely loved and respected, but he seems to be much more on the sort of decent bod side of things. So the original idea with the internet and with the web was all around egalitarianism, access to information, collaboration, all of that sort of stuff. Now that has rather been swallowed by the Silicon Valley tech giants and a whole bunch of other people, and he's certainly not happy with the situation, because it's exactly counter to what he wanted the internet to be. And with all of his skills and passion and connections and abilities, he's one of a very large number of people who trying to steer the ship in a different direction, because it does feel like we're at a bit of an inflection point with a lot of these technologies. Is the horse isn't out of the gate, and you can always out of the barn thing, and you can always put the horse back in the barn and behind the gate. It just takes a lot more effort over time. So people are seeing, to mix metaphors, can we steer this ship another way? Because it's heading towards a really bad thing, a bit of a shipwreck, if you will. But let's see if we can get it out into calm, open waters again. But it's going to become a fight. It's already a bit of a fight, and it's not going to get any easier or simpler as the lines really get drawn around it.
Absolutely. It reminds me, and I'm afraid now that I should have looked this up before we had our conversation, but it reminds me of a product that died on the vine called by Novell, called Digital Me. And the advantage of it that I understood was not so much that, I mean, people understood that it was better if you could be the steward of your own data from a privacy standpoint, but it was really positioned as a convenience. That when you go to an insurance company, you can say, this is the information they're allowed to have. I only have to enter it in once here, and then it can be accessed by my health provider, or by the university, or the job I apply to, or the girl I wish to date. That you can turn the dials depending on what service or what interaction you're dealing with. But I think that the challenge is, just if you're going to commercialize it, people have to understand the merits of it. And there are so many dials to turn when you choose who can see what and what you really care about. It's almost as bewildering as Facebook's privacy policies, right? That you can actually manipulate, but you don't know they're there, or they're too, obfuscated.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, that idea of people who have the time, because time is a privilege, in itself, to really understand this and to deal with it. But also, I think the thing, or certainly that I see here, is that concepts like this, so that's a digital identity concept, excuse me, digital identity and so forth, and things like the pods and data trusts. This isn't just about saying, well, let's strip money out of the system. That this is, you could build really beautiful services and businesses, and there are startups in how to do this, in how to help people navigate all of this, in how to help them manage it. And organizations could also get a lot better, and it'll force them to get a lot better to say, this is what we do with your data. This is what we want to do with your data. I wonder if we'll see, if this sort of stuff really takes off, and I wanted to, we'll see a lot fewer of the, what are they called, data brokerages, the people in the background who's scooping up data about your browsing habits and selling it to gosh knows whom. We might start to see a lot less of that as things clamp down, but we may see people wanting to do their own form of data brokerage in a way that really sort of enables what they want and what their communities want, or what their organization wants. So I think it's very powerful, but also the technology is improving. And as the technology improves and our service design gets better and our user experience gets better, and our understanding of even neuroscience and cognitive neuropsychology gets better, this starts to become more and more of a go. It doesn't have to be an immensely dense, impossible to understand thing that only a small number of nerds are able to understand. Like, everybody can be a nerd about it. And how can we build the services that also help people navigate those? So it's not necessarily just platforms. You could have all kinds of intermediaries, people who work in their community to help people understand what their data rights are and help them understand how to navigate it, like we have now with other kinds of digital services. You've got the people who are willing to sit there and help you understand what's going on. But it's quite early days in a lot of this thinking. I mean, data trusts have only come along relatively recently in the last couple of years, and there's a lot of really fascinating arguments going on in the literature about it, which is awesome. I love watching academics argue. They do it in such
There's a beautiful example from this article that Britain's National Health Service is using, and the way I kind of metaphor that comes to my mind is it's almost like a digital medical alert bracelet, but much more detailed, so that if you are for example, suffering from dementia, for example, what are the kinds of interventions that nursing staff could do that would be comfortable to you, right? Or is there somebody we should get in touch with? And that could all be available through a data trust. And I think the pods was the technology that was being trialed for this, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that does sound sort of, I want to read more about it. It sounds like a mixture between a data trust and the pods concept, possibly with the data trust administering the pods. And yeah, that's so lovely, because my first thought was, hang on, but people with dementia might not be in a fit state to be stewarding their personal data all the time. But I did see, it's there, and people can do it on their behalf.
Right, and that guardian can't necessarily be there when there's an emergency.
But you can have this information that says, needs extra help with, I see that the trial, something like they're trialing of 50 patients or something, which is very, very, very cool.
It's a good modest number. Yeah.
It's a good, it feels like a good number. It was really interesting to see, them talking about, could we integrate it with other data over time, maybe activity data from things like fitness trackers. And of course, my first thought was, okay, some fitness trackers are better at privacy than others, but some of them are pretty disastrous with privacy. So you're saying this is all about stewarding your personal data using input devices that are all about not stewarding your personal data. And I thought that was really interesting. But certainly I understand the concept of, people being able to say this, you may use this data for this purpose. And I think health will be, a huge area for that. So one of the, for example, rather than 23andMe with people giving their genetic data to 23andMe and 23andMe saying, well, we can do whatever we like with it. That's just an example. There are plenty of other companies doing the same thing. And then, some of that data does get used for medical research, and most people can agree that that's a great use for this kind of data to help tackle rare diseases, etc. But how cool would it be if I was the steward of my own health data and could say, yes, that organization can use this data for exactly that purpose, but not for other purposes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's where data trusts come in again, or pods. I think it's really exciting. People haven't quite figured it out yet, but there are lots of pilots happening all across the world in everything from health data to electricity data, in what we can do about this to help build much more sustainable and resilient communities.
You mentioned wearables and the security risks that come from that. I don't know if you remember a story, but Fitbit had a social media aspect to it where you could compare your runs to other people. And as a result, it was publicly announcing people's jogging routes. And it was actually alerting people to the perimeters of military bases, because the people on the base would run around the base. And actually, we're doing a good job of describing to whoever exactly where some of these bases were and the number of people there.
Yeah, it was a little bit of an issue. I used to use wearables because I liked the idea. But then I suddenly realized that I was giving a whole bunch of real personal data, like health data, to anybody.
A sneaker company.
And I still use like an app when I go for an actual run or a cycle. I use it to track that. But for the most part, I'm pretty careful about it. But they do have, it's really tough. And there are lots of way funnier, but way more horrible stories about wearables than that. And of course, you've got to look at not just the wearables company, but the attack vector that it provides into your other accounts, and who owns that company. Fitbit was recently bought by a very large, I think it's a $1 billion internet firm, one of the Silicon Valley giants, and a whole bunch of people immediately left Fitbit. They stopped using Fitbit because they were really concerned about the privacy implications about like who this bigger company was and what they might do with the data. So it's certainly it's a fascinating time to be involved with all of this. But I see there are a lot of people trying really hard to do good stuff, and I think that that's a cause for major hope and a fair amount of burnout and angry ranting on the internet, but huge hope.
So we've talked a little bit about the possibility of connections between national levels, provincial or state levels, city levels. And it seems like there's an awful lot of activity at the city level around smart cities, partly because I think it's in a way large enough that it can assemble an awful lot of data, but also all within one jurisdiction, and therefore the people can manipulate it better and act on it better. You talk about a Cambrian explosion. I always love that expression. When it comes to the definition of a smart city, what are some of the examples you see being tried?
There's a whole bunch, and the big thing is the definitions changing, and I think that's part of what's going on, is because there's such a wide range of definitions or misunderstandings or understandings of the term. You're seeing a lot of people try stuff. So a great example that comes to mind as how exactly not to do it was the Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto, the Sidewalk Toronto situation. If anybody wants to go and look that up, Bianca Wiley's writing on the subject, coverage on the subject, was just incredible, and very firm activism around it. So that was going to be a smart city built on the waterfront in Toronto, with Sidewalk Labs, who are an Alphabet company, sort of running the development of it. But it went really badly wrong in a whole bunch of ways, mostly around their public engagement was poor, to put it mildly, and it got a lot of people really offside, because it started to feel a lot like they were setting in place a surveillance city with the data to be owned by possibly the large tech company, and just all kinds of things. I mean, it's this fascinating saga. If people really like long-running, intricate sagas, this is the one for you in real life. A lot of it is about the fundamental thing about smart cities is trying to build cities that are resilient, sustainable, and enable people to live better lives at the end of the day, using technology as one of the ways to do that. Not the only way. So it's not necessarily about hooking everything up to a camera and a mic and starting to run gigantic surveillance algorithms in the background, right? That's what some people are doing. There are lots of people who don't want that to be the case. And there are other things like saying, how can we get a lot better at monitoring our infrastructure? So especially the BIM crowd are really into that. But can we put sensors in things like our water pipes and along our transportation routes and things like that? Can we start building a really good digital understanding of what's going on in our city? And this is where digital twins really, really starts to come into its own of what's going on. Digital twins. Now that's, the BIM crowd is really interested in digital twins. It's like CAD on roids. It's fascinating. And smart cities and digital twins interact very strongly as concepts. But smart cities is, so cities that are smart in that people can move around them, live high quality lives, have access to, high quality education, high quality jobs. They're healthy, they're ecologically good, they're sustainable. There's a whole bunch of people trialing different things. And they need to be, to a large extent, they need to be local. They need to be at the city scale or smaller, because what makes something sustainable and resilient and happy and healthy is a hyper-local situation. It's going to depend on who's living there, what the climate is, what the conditions are, what the economy is like, all of that kind of stuff, right? So people are doing different things. Some people are working on setting in place really good sort of rules around planning and infrastructure that you put in when you put in a new suburb, for example. Some people are getting really good at dealing with water use and wastewater. And because as climate change comes in, water is going to be a bigger and bigger issue for a whole bunch of reasons, especially if you're on the coast. Some people are trying to do better around pollutants, in our air and our water. There's a whole range of stuff happening. If people are interested, there is the Smart Cities Council, which is an international group with offshoots is the wrong word. Offices is the wrong word. Anyway, with local presences, there you go, with local presences, indeed, down to the hyperlocal, who are doing a lot of work. They've set up, there's educational resources, there is networking, there are networking and communication abilities, there are awards, there's all kinds of stuff. And so if one's interested in it, and a really strong community of people who are really passionate about this, in anybody's area of the world, they'll be able to find people who are working on this and who want to work together on it.
I sort of led into this. I shouldn't have front loaded the concept, but where do you see the future for like a smart nation or a smart state, or is it appropriate to start at because you've actually talked about the council level as being quite important and the hyper local being quite important, and yet in the media, at least what I've noticed, it's all smart city. How will the creation of a smart city impact the creation of a smart province or a smart nation?
That's such an interesting question. And here we probably come to interoperability again. So this isn't just saying the interoperability of our data or the interoperability of our tech stacks. It could be the interoperability of our wider systems and indeed our paradigms, how we want to live. How one city wants to live and what it sees as being a smart city may not be the same as a city 80 k's away. What does that mean for what a smart nation looks like? I'm imagining that unless one lives in incredibly homogeneous cultures, which is less and less the case pretty much anywhere, right? Which personally I think is excellent. I love diversity. Probably what a smart nation will look more like is really great decision making. Right? So how are we making beautiful, smart, evidence-informed decisions around what we're doing so that we are doing the best thing for our people and the other critters that we steward for. Whereas at the local level, that will probably continue to be quite local. Certainly I know Canada's got like huge provinces. Here in New Zealand, we don't really have huge provinces. So the roll-up would be quite different. But I imagine that one could also have some really interesting conversations if one's building a smart city, or when one's building a smart city, to talk with one's neighboring cities. So they might either be in the same place geographically, they might be in a different place geographically, but in the same space culturally, to put it like that. But it's really to start linking out and saying, well, these are the things that we think make a really smart city. Who else is interested in doing a similar kind of thing, or wants to work with us, or wants to collaborate with us? Or who could we talk to who thinks differently, but it might help nuance and inform our views? So if we're saying that smart cities are all about collaboration and sustainability, that's a paradigm I think one can roll out really strongly. But there will always be a hyperlocal element to it, I'm sure, much as we may start to see similar things crop up again and again and again, because people often want similar kinds of things: clean air, clean water, a sense of personal empowerment and agency. What that looks like is going to be different, though.
So you're making me realize in this discussion that smart city is really a horrible branding exercise, because it's like saying a hammer house, right? Just because it's put together with hammers and nails, that's not how you would describe the home. It's not the tool that we care about, it's the end result. Right? So are we trying to make a clean city or a convenient city or a just city? And if you focused in that respect, then your definition of clean might be easier to get your arms around than just smart.
I think that's a great point. And it reminds me a lot of other concepts, like, for example, open government. Is unless one's nerdy about open government, people are like, but what does it mean? I mean, how does it, why would I care? The classic journalism question of why would anyone care about this? And I think you're right, but smart cities is it's really useful for I guess the practitioners and the people who are interested in it, because it does bring the conversations under an umbrella around which you can start having that conversation and building that knowledge and building those resources. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. If one's going out, and this is very much a personal opinion, and I haven't checked it with my smart cities people. Sorry. But I imagine in your communication, when you're going out into your communities, a lot of people aren't necessarily going to know what a smart city is and or care what a smart city is, or they'll instantly think this is some sort of techno-utopian, techno-dystopian situation where the technologists are in charge again. But saying, yes, we want to hear what makes a city great for you. That will in turn build a smart city, but you're going to need those the layers of communication, right, in between, to make sure that everybody's got a strong understanding of what's going on. So, yeah, I think you're dead on, but I'm still going to keep using smart cities for the next while.
Well, that's the term of art.
Well, it's wide enough as well. If we spoke about clean cities, that's about clean cities. If we spoke about sustainable cities, that speaks to sustainability. It doesn't speak to other factors, because there are like 8 or 9 major factors that people measure smart cities against. It's wide. And there are global rankings and things. It's really interesting. But again, lots and lots and lots of conversation happening about what it looks like.
So we're heading into the home stretch here, and I want to thank you for your generosity in a couple of counts. One is that you are clearly bilingual and are willing to say data rather than data. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining me on this side of the pond for that. And also, as we got to know one another, I'm sure it was evident to you that I'm a big fan of a lot of Elon Musk's work, or at least many of his approaches to things. And you did express some reservation about some of the things that Elon Musk is up to. And in my imagination, I could see a few things that one might be critical of Elon Musk about. One in particular is that he seems to have an allergy to public transit, or at least public transit the way most of us would understand it, which is thousands of people being conveyed to work or pleasure or family or whatever in favor of private vehicles. What's your reaction to that? Do you see that as a challenge to what we hope for in the future?
Well, yeah. It's such an interesting one. Reading up on it, it seems he's mostly just uncomfortable with the idea of trains. He doesn't like trains. He likes the idea of roads. It's very possible that that's partly informed by where he comes from and where he lives and who he is. Mm-hmm. I doubt that he ever had to use a train in his life. He probably gets ferried around quite a lot in quite nice cars. Mm-hmm. That's an assumption. It's interesting. The thing is, I think sometimes one has to be a little bit careful about criticizing things one knows absolutely nothing about and has never experienced in any way. That's not always the case. There are things that I've never experienced that I still feel free to criticize. But this is, without getting into details, but this one is definitely interesting, has raised a lot of eyebrows. There are a few things I see here. One, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I think that's kind of probably the major issue here. He seems to think that all of the people who've designed mass transportation over the decades clearly are all idiots, and he knows better than everybody else. The thing is, his dream cannot possibly work. I've seen stats saying that even if they get, the boring company, very funny, even if they get it all absolutely perfect and they manage to get quadrupling the current ability to ferry people, they might get to something like, I think the stat was, I think I wrote it down here, like 8,000. Hang on, give me a moment. Right, so here's some fun stats for you. Highways today can carry about 2,000 cars per lane per hour. Autonomous vehicles might quadruple that. The best trains can carry 50,000 passengers per lane per hour. Mm-hmm. There is no way that Elon and his folk can build anything that can shift that amount of people better than a train. We can get better at trains. Absolutely, we could get a lot better at trains. But to say that these other situations will be better, no. I can see autonomous vehicles and so forth, doing that, what they call the last mile. So you've got your major corridors that are just moving tons of people back and forth. And then you've got your autonomous vehicles, you've got your e-scooters, you've got your e-bikes, your active modes, you're walking, you're running. There's a whole bunch of ways to get to your home or your office or wherever it is that you're going from that mass transit thing. But trains, I think, and other modes are probably more likely to be where it's at. We also know that cities are only going to have more and more and more people packed into them. Well, we did before COVID.
Yeah, it remains to be seen. Yeah.
But as a rule, people do tend to intensify. Also, we're just making more people, so cities are generally going to get more and more dense. So we really do need to be thinking about density here, and that also doesn't mean having 30 or 40 layers of tunnels with individual pods shunting around, because there's also an effect in transportation where it's kind of like cupboard space. The more you have of it, the more you fill it up. Bigger motorways don't mean less gridlock.
Right.
There are tons of studies about this around the world. We need better public transport, but that's a much more collectivist view of it, saying, yes, we'll all have to make some sacrifices. We won't get there maybe quite as fast, but then again, we'd be sitting in gridlock if we all decided to do our own thing. But we can work on this. We can get better at it. But yeah, I just think he's dead wrong. But it tells me a lot about the thinking of a staunch individualist who doesn't understand what it's like to be in a community or a group of people, and that we can do it and we should do it. And it's going to be more efficient. It was a fascinating article. I giggled a lot and then face palmed a lot and then head desked once or twice and went, okay, well, look, fair enough. There will be some people who will prefer that uptake. But overall, I don't think he's onto a winning notion with this one.
I'm actually much more aligned with your thinking than you might imagine, because I am a fan of what Elon's doing. The reason I'm not so setting aside SpaceX and even the Boring Company, looking exclusively at Tesla, I think that electric vehicles are better for the planet than internal combustion vehicles and can continuously get better.
Yes.
I also think that autonomous vehicles will get us out of the notion of private car ownership. And the reason I think that lends itself to a future that you would prefer, that I would prefer, is twofold. One is if you go on a trip, you rarely bring, like if you fly somewhere, I don't know about you, but I rarely rent a vehicle because I'm not comfortable driving there. And so now I am a citizen of public transit. If you don't have a car, you're much more likely to be a citizen of public transit than if you do. If you have a car, if you're fortunate enough to have a car, you're like, why am I spending all this money on this bus that's in front of me? I want to be able to get from A to B efficiently in a car. And so it's almost like two parallel universes. If we can get to a point where we don't need to own a car, even in a city that needs a car to get around, we'll be much more open to the idea of public transit, because as you point out, the gridlock will still be there, whether I'm in an autonomous vehicle or not. But if I can just say to Google, I want to get from A to B, and it says, take a private car to here, then get on the bus and get to here. And you can do it way faster than the car will let you.
Yeah.
But we'll never get there if we're all owning cars. That's my personal bias.
I agree predominantly with what you've said. I think we have to be aware of a couple of things. Uber and Lyft were supposed to reduce gridlock in cities and had exactly the opposite effect. There's also more conversation around the world about the active modes. Can we get people cycling, walking, scooting? Where possible? Not that doesn't work for everybody, absolutely, but where possible, how can we encourage people to move around in those other ways? They also take up less space. Venture capital backs a lot of these situations as well. They're heavily subsidized, if not by governments, by venture capitalists. What happens if the money dries up? Yeah. Before the technology is sort of mainstream enough to be affordable, then. But those are all sort of fringe things. I agree that autonomous is great. Also, humans are generally pretty rubbish at piloting tons of metal around. We're okay with it. We could kill each other a lot more than we do, but we hurt and kill each other like quite a lot. And good autonomous systems could hopefully, this is all very much hopes, get better at that. I agree with you that EVs are generally better than fuel cars. It depends on the electricity generation mix. It depends on a whole bunch of things, right? MIT recently released just an awesome calculator that shows you how different types of cars, hybrids and EVs and things, with models compare against each other on cost. It's a lifetime cost on cost versus carbon. It's really interesting going around there. There are some cars one should just never buy if you want to break both your wallet and the world. But we're not there yet, and I don't think it's going to be a sudden switchover. It's like anything else. Things will start to slide in. So in densely populated areas, we may start to see more things like buses on dedicated lanes so they don't have to deal with human drivers, become more autonomous,
right,
for example. There's a whole bunch of ways it could happen, but it's a classic thing of invariably humans don't replace technology. They just add new technology on top of it, but some of the older technology remains in various ways. I know I live out in a rural area. I use the train to get to and from Wellington where I work because it's just nicer in every possible way, right? And I love the train. But I also know that I have to own a car out here because for the rest of the time, if I want to get around, it's a rural area. There's not a lot of public transport and the distances are quite big. And I don't always have the time to take a 20K ride to a nice cafe that I like. But we really will, yeah, I broadly agree with you. I think the thing is we just need to be careful as we develop these technologies that we're not accidentally building in a whole bunch of new perverse incentives. So my final warning there would be, when cars came along, everyone said, oh my God, well, first they said, what the hell is this? This is wrong, it'll never replace. And then it became usual and it became normal. And then we built cities around cars. Mm-hmm. And the effects of building cities around cars is going to last us for generations, and it generally hasn't been good.
Yeah, no, I agree. We should be more mindful, definitely, as we embrace this technology. Mm-hmm. The other shoe to drop, of course, is congestion charging, because this idea that an Uber can run around or especially a robotically piloted Uber could drive around all day just to avoid paying for parking. Sure. And taking up a public good, which is the space on the road. So, and also when we stop using, at least in this country, ostensibly a lot of our roads are paid for with gas tax, petrol tax. Exactly. And when we're not using gas, where's the money going to come from? The city's going to say, tilt. Okay, you got to pay to use this road, and maybe it'll be a subdivision charge, and we'll have Ubers running around the subdivision, and then I take a bus or a train for the rest of it. So it remains to be seen.
It's going to be really interesting. It's certainly one that people are battling with is, how do we pay for the roads? And to those people who say transportation agencies will be dead in 10 years, except for the fact that they'll be zombies and just collecting taxes to prop them up. To those people, I say, once again, I don't think you know what you're talking about, mate. Transportation agencies are actually kind of important and do cool work. Admittedly, I'm biased. I'm the first person to say that, but I think it's and what does that look like at the national regulation level and the national policy level, and then down to the federal level and down to the state level and down to the local level, and how do people want the cities to run and look like, and how do they want to move around, and how do we make sure that this is more equitable than previous ways to do, no answers.
Yeah, well, and it's going to take longer than I imagine, because I will confess, I own the third car I thought would be my last. So we'll see what happens.
I certainly last year, I for mostly safety reasons, bought a new car, and it was petrol, and I was like, but EV charging infrastructure out where I live isn't such a thing. Yeah. And I'm thinking it's probably the last car. It might not be the last car that I at least drive sometimes, but it's probably my last petrol car. But as you say, these things always take, iPhones caught on quicker than anyone expected, but big infrastructural changes can take quite a bit longer, because you have to change the infrastructure and the organizational structures around it. So I reckon, I shouldn't reckon because everyone's always wrong, but this stuff to be out in mainstream is probably a couple of decades away, at least for a lot of places, right? Some places it's generations, some places it'll be faster than that, but a couple of decades easily, I imagine, for mainstream usage.
Yeah, we've also certainly for suburban or rural, the cities will change a lot quicker. I think we can agree.
They will. But we're going to have to change hearts and minds as well. A lot of people are not going to be comfortable with the idea of running around in something that a human isn't piloting, for example.
I know.
It's going to be fascinating. It's an exciting future. I'm looking forward to it.
So you've been terrific. I have one final question. and that is, do you ever dream of moving to Estonia?
So funny story. I have wanted to get one of the Estonian e-residency visas for years and years and years and years, like when they first released them. But the final thing you actually do is it has an in-person component, and the nearest in-person component was in Australia. And I didn't want to spend the carbon on flying to Australia to go and do a thumbprint or whatever it is. I've not been to Estonia, so I couldn't really say. They're doing some really, really, really interesting stuff in the digital identity and e-government and open government spaces. So I'd certainly like to visit it before I made that decision. The big thing would be, what is the weather like? Does it get sufficiently warm in winter? I mean, in summer, I need warmth and sunlight.
Yeah.
But yeah, honestly, it's probably not the top of my list of countries I'd move to if I was given a chance to do that. But never say never, right? Who knows? I might visit it one day and be like, I'm in love. I want a full residency visa, please. And then see what they say.
It is a fascinating experiment, right? I mean, it's the closest thing I can think of to a smart country.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. I do see people talk about it a lot, in e-governments and open governments and big circles, and saying, why don't we just do what Estonia does? And a lot of people haven't understood that Estonia was able to do that because they were basically climbing out of rubble. A lot of other countries have existing infrastructure, both, politically, economically, all of that sort of things that did act. It's a bit difficult to fundamentally remake your entire civilization when you've got all that stuff kind of in place. Estonia had a different civilization, a different situation there, and some really brave people and some powerful communicators as well. But it's not a model that one can just, or necessarily should just replicate. It's something that we can learn from and watch with huge interest, and possibly want to go and visit and sort of meet people and talk with them about what they're up to, and maybe look at a castle or two while we're there.
That's a good idea. But I think you're right. I think it does get a little cold.
Probably, yeah. I imagine. But you never know. I find life is really, really long, and every time I say I'm never going to do something, I'm doing it within a few years. And a lot of times when I say I'm going to do something, I don't do it. So I've just learned to be less definite.
Well, that's a beautiful and affirmative message to end on. My guest today was Aimee Whitcroft. Thank you, Aimee, for being my guest.
Thank you, Tim. It's such fun.
For me too. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.